The truck came down State Highway 18 the same way. Trouble usually comes in Osage County. Slow, unhurried, with no particular interest in what anyone thought about it. It was a Tuesday in early March, the sky the color of old pewter, the fields on both sides of the road still carrying the gray-brown exhaustion of winter. Della Voss heard it before she saw it, that particular diesel rumble that distinguishes a working truck from everything else on the road. And she came out of the barn to watch it turn into the drive. The driver didn't get out. He just pulled the lever and the bed tilted, and the fence posts came down in a sliding cascade, cracked ones, split ones posts with rusted nails still threaded through them at angles that suggested decades of use rather than decades of care. They hit the frozen ground with a sound like something being settled rather than discarded. Then the truck leveled its bed, pulled back onto the highway, and was gone. Della stood at the edge of the pile for a moment. She was 19 years old, her hair pulled back under a wool cap that had been her grandfather's, her hands in gloves that were 2 sizes too large for her. She looked at the posts the way a person looks at a problem they've been expecting, not with surprise, but with the particular focus of someone cataloging what they're actually working with versus what they'd hoped for. She picked up the nearest post. Cedar, she thought, pressing her thumbnail into the grain near the base. Dense, tight grain, the wood still carrying its faint reddish smell, even after what must have been 20 years in the ground. She set it aside, picked up the next one. Pine old growth by the feel of it, soft at the edges, where weather had worked its way in, but dry in the center. She set that one in a different spot. By the time Gordon Pruitt's truck slowed on the road, he always slowed past the Voss property these days, with the particular patience of a man who considers observation a form of productivity. Della had sorted 14 posts into 2 groups without fully deciding she was doing it. Pruitt's window came down. His arm rested on the door. Planning to build something out of that? The words carried across the distance between them with the easy projection of a man accustomed to being heard across fields. Della looked up, thinking about it. Pruitt's expression did what it always did. A small compression around the eyes, not quite skepticism, not quite amusement, something between the two that he had developed over 30 years of watching other people's decisions play out. "That's rotten lumber, Della." He said her name the way older men in this county said the names of young women, with a faint emphasis that was not unkind, but was also not quite respectful. The tone reserved for someone not yet fully admitted to the category of person whose choices merit serious consideration. "Some of it," she said, and turned back to the pile. She heard his window go up, heard the truck accelerate south. She did not watch it go. What Della did not say to Gordon Pruitt or to anyone else in Osage County that March was that she had a plan. Not because she was being strategic about secrecy, but because the plan existed primarily in the form of a conviction, and a conviction without visible evidence is not something you announce to people who measure competence in yields per acre. You build the evidence first, then you talk. The conviction had arrived in the second semester of her freshman year at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater in a soil science lecture delivered by Dr. Leon Gruber in a classroom that smelled of chalk dust and damp winter coats. Dr. Gruber was 62 years old and had the posture of a man who had spent 4 decades crouching near the ground, examining things other people walked over. He had made a statement in that lecture, not dramatically, not with any particular emphasis, as if it were simply a fact the class should absorb the way they absorbed all the others that had taken up residence in Della's mind and declined to leave. Degraded land is not dead land, it is waiting land. She had written it in her notebook with the date in his name, the way you mark something you intend to return to. In the 18 months since it had become the thing she thought about, when she thought about the 43 acres in Osage County, where Hector Voss had spent half a century growing soybeans and corn on soil that was now by any honest measure tired. Not ruined, not past recovery, just tired in the way that things get tired when they've been asked to perform without ever being restored. She had left OSU at the end of her second year. Not dismissed, she had left deliberately the week after she found the bank letter in Hector's kitchen drawer, the one with the 90-day language she recognized from the 2 agricultural finance courses she had completed before the practical situation at home overtook the theoretical one at school. She had finished her finals, packed her room in the residence hall, driven back to Osage County on a Thursday afternoon, and told Hector she was home for a while. He had not asked why. This was characteristic. Hector Voss communicated the way certain landscapes communicate in what was present, rather than what was said in the particular quality of silence that follows a significant fact. He had looked at her for a moment over the kitchen table with eyes that were the same gray-blue as hers, and then he had gotten up and poured her a cup of coffee, and that had been the entirety of the conversation. She had not told him about the bank letter. She did not know yet whether he knew she had found it. The letter had been in the second drawer on the left side of the kitchen cabinet under a seed catalog and a folded map of the property that she had assumed was an old survey until she looked more closely. The letter was from First National Bank of Pawhuska. It referenced an agricultural operating loan and a terms modification made 18 months earlier, and it used the phrase failure to demonstrate recovery of productive capacity in the flat, bureaucratic language that banks use when they mean something specific and prefer not to say it specifically. 90 days. If the property could not demonstrate a credible path to financial recovery, the bank would begin evaluation of its options regarding the collateral. The collateral was the land, all 43 acres, the house, the barn, everything Hector had. Della had read the letter twice standing at the kitchen cabinet, then folded it exactly as she had found it and put it back under the seed catalog. Then she had gone out to the slope behind the barn and stood there in the late February cold, looking at the soil thin, pale crusted at the surface, in the way that soil crusts when the organic matter is gone, and there is nothing left to keep the particles from sealing against each other. And she had thought about Dr. Gruber's statement and decided it was true. Then she had thought about what to do about it. The fence posts were her answer, or the beginning of it. She had spent 3 weeks in February and early March making calls to neighboring farms, to the county extension office, to 2 ranching operations south of Pawhuska that she knew from Hector's network. She was looking for old fence posts, she told them. Untreated wood cedar or locust preferred pine acceptable. She would haul them herself. She did not explain what for, because the explanation required context that she wasn't sure most of her callers would find credible over the phone. What she was building or intended to build was a hedgerow. Not in the ornamental sense, not as a windbreak in the simple meaning of that word, but as an integrated living system. A dense planted boundary of native shrubs and woody plants anchored by buried and standing wooden posts, following the natural contours of the slope rather than the straight lines that most fencing in this county followed. The posts would be the skeleton, the plants would be the flesh. The soil would be the patient. She had read about hedgerows in a regenerative agriculture journal that Dr. Gruber had left on the seminar room table in October of her second year, a gesture she was now fairly certain had been deliberate rather than absent-minded. She had taken the journal back to her room and read the relevant article 3 times, then gone looking for every other source she could find on contour planting, silvopasture integration, and the specific soil biology of post-agricultural recovery. What she found, across sources that ranged from peer-reviewed journals to extension service publications to the documented practices of operations in Missouri, Tennessee, and the Texas Hill Country, was consistent. A properly constructed hedgerow on degraded slopeland did several things simultaneously that no other single intervention could do. It slowed water movement across the surface. It began rebuilding organic matter in the soil. It created habitat that attracted the birds and insects that perform natural pest management. It could over time restore the kind of biological activity in the soil that turns thin, pale, crusted ground into something that holds moisture, resists erosion, and supports the kinds of yields that Hector's land had not produced in years. The timeline for full effect was measured in years, not months. But some effects were measurable in a single season if you started correctly. She intended to start correctly. The barn became her sorting facility. She laid each post on the floor and went through the same process, press the thumbnail into the grain tap, with her knuckle bring the end close and smell it. Cedar had a particular resistance and a particular smell, dry and slightly sweet, that she could identify reliably after the second truckload. Black locust was denser, still heavy for its size, with a grain so tight it was almost waxy. Old pine was softer, grayer, the wood smelling of thyme rather than the tree, And it was the pine she set aside in the far corner with the most care because pine was what she needed underground. The horizontal burial technique involved laying logs and posts beneath the soil surface where they would absorb moisture during wet periods and release it slowly during dry ones. As the wood decomposed over seasons and years, it fed the fungi and earthworms and microorganisms that were Dr. Gruber had explained in the soil biology unit, not merely present in healthy soil, but constitutive of it. The soil was not a medium in which biology happened. The biology was the soil. Remove it, and you had mineral particles held together by nothing producing, nothing losing ground with every rain. She had pulled nails from every post she kept. Hundreds of them accumulated over 3 weeks of evenings in the barn with a pry bar and a bucket, her hands developing blisters in the first week, and then the harder, more permanent tissue that forms when blisters are not allowed to rest. The green notebook tracked the inventory: cedar 41 posts in usable condition, black locust 23, untreated pine 34, rejected due to chemical treatment indicators 19. The treated ones she had stacked outside the barn. She would find a use for them that didn't involve contact with the soil she was trying to rebuild. Gordon Pruitt had delivered the treated ones. He had pulled up in his flatbed one afternoon with what looked like a genuinely helpful load: thick oak posts recently decommissioned from a fence project on his south field, still carrying their pressure-treated green color at the bases. He had stacked them in the drive himself, which was more physical assistance than he usually offered anyone, and stood back with the expression of a man who has done a good thing. Della had looked at the green-tinted wood for a moment. "I appreciate it, Gordon. I can't use these." The shift in his expression was subtle but complete, the way a conversation changes register without either person acknowledging it. "That's good lumber. It's treated. The preservative leaches into soil biology." She said it without apology, without softening, because she had learned early from Hector that softening a factual statement for the sake of social comfort tends to make the fact less useful. "I'm trying to rebuild the biology out there." Pruitt had looked at the posts, then at the slope behind the barn where she had begun her preliminary site work. His jaw moved in the way it moved when he was deciding whether to say something or absorb it. He chose absorption. He got back in his truck. He drove away without the posts. She had the feeling, watching him go, that she had done something that would require attention later. What she did not know yet was that Pruitt's interest in the Voss property was not merely the neighborly concern he performed so naturally. Hector's land bordered Pruitt's on two sides. For 3 years, Pruitt had made quiet, reasonable offers to purchase the eastern section $40 over county market rate, always framed as a favor, as a solution to Hector's difficulties that would benefit both parties. Hector had declined each time with the same brevity he applied to most things: a single word or a slight movement of the head that communicated finality without drama. Pruitt had accepted each refusal with the patience of a man who understood that the situation had more time to work in his favor than Hector did. The bank letter's existence was not a secret Pruitt had engineered, but it was a timeline he was aware of. Della drew her contour lines in the second week of March. She had the property topographic map, the one from the kitchen drawer that she had believed was a simple survey, and she transferred its elevations onto graph paper, working at the kitchen table in the evenings after Hector had gone to bed. The curves she drew were not the straight lines that fencing in this county followed by default. The grid logic of agricultural organization that made sense for machine cultivation, but had nothing to do with how water actually moved across ground. Her lines followed the land. They traced the subtle ridges and swales of the slope behind the barn, the way you trace a fingerprint, not imposing a pattern, but finding one that was already there. Hector came into the kitchen once while she was working, poured himself a glass of water, looked at what she was doing for a moment without asking, and went back to bed. She took this characteristically as a form of permission. She filled 11 pages of the green notebook with plans, plant lists, post-placement calculations, and a material schedule that she revised 4 times as the incoming post donations clarified what she actually had to work with. On page 8, she wrote a note to herself that she read most mornings before going out. "You are not building a fence. You are building a system. The fence posts are only the part people can see." By the time April arrived, she had enough material to begin. The first day of setting posts was a Saturday. She worked alone, which was by choice rather than necessity. Something about the beginning of this felt like it required solitude, the way certain decisions require solitude, so that the full weight of the choice sits in one person's hands. She set the first cedar post at the uphill end of her westernmost contour line at 7 in the morning, in ground that had softened through the week's warming temperatures, but still had the cold resistance of Osage County soil in early spring. She tamped it with a manual post driver, a 40-pound cylinder she had borrowed from Aldous Hatch's son, and the work was what physical work always is, when you do it correctly, not easy but clear. Each blow had a logic. Each post had a position determined by the diagrams in the contour map. She was not improvising. She was executing. By noon, she had set 14 posts along the first third of the western contour line. Her shoulders were burning. She drank water from the thermos she'd brought out sitting on the slope with the posts arrayed behind her and the open land below, and she looked at what 14 posts looked like against 43 acres. Small. Insufficient. Like the beginning of something. She went back to work. Hector came out at 2 o'clock. He did not offer to help. His doctor had limited his physical labor, a limitation he observed selectively. He stood at the edge of the slope and watched her set 3 posts. Then he went back to the house. Pruitt drove past at 4:15. He did not slow down. This was, she noted, a change. What she felt at the end of that first day was not pride exactly. Pride requires an audience, even an internal one, and she was too tired for the performance of it. What she felt was closer to what you feel when a long calculation finally resolves not joy, but the particular satisfaction of having produced a number that matches the one you predicted. She wrote in the green notebook April 1st post day, 21 posts. Western contour first third. Soil condition at depth better than surface suggests. Beginning to understand what I'm actually doing here. In the second week of April, she knocked on every door within 4 miles of the Voss property. Not to ask for more posts, she had enough, but to explain briefly what she was doing and why, and to offer a clear answer to the question she knew people were developing as they watched her work on the slope. Most people listened with the polite attention of people who have already formed an opinion, but are willing to hear something out. Aldous Hatch asked the most specific questions about the wood species selection and the contour calculation method, and she answered him in full. His wife brought out coffee without being asked, which Della took as a reasonably good sign. Loretta Pruitt answered the door at the Pruitt place and listened carefully and said, "Gordon's out back if you want to talk to him." Della said she'd come by another time. Loretta looked at her for a moment with something in her expression that Della couldn't quite read, then nodded and closed the door. What happened instead in the third week of April arrived without warning. She came back from setting posts one evening to find Hector standing at the kitchen table with a piece of mail in his hand. He was holding it the way he held things that required him to decide something slightly away from himself, as if creating distance between the object and his body gave him more perspective on it. She recognized the bank's logo on the letterhead. He set it on the table without looking at her. She sat down across from him. He looked out the window at the slope. "I know about the first one," she said. The quality of silence in the room shifted, not broke but changed register, the way the pressure in your ears changes when altitude changes, subtle but unmistakable. Hector looked at her then. His eyes were gray-blue and carrying the specific sediment of a long life, the accumulation of things seen and things endured and things chosen. He held her gaze for a long moment. "How long?" His voice was the voice of a man who spent it carefully. "February. I came home after I found it." He was quiet. Outside, the light on the slope was going gold with late afternoon. He looked at the letter, then back out the window, then at her. "What you're doing out there, how long does it take?" It was not a challenge. It was a question asked with complete sincerity by a person who needed the practical answer. To show measurable results one season. To demonstrate financial recovery to a bank. We need something concrete by fall. He was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down again. "Then you'd better work faster." That was the full conversation. She picked up the letter, read it 60 days now, not 90, the clock having advanced while the first letter sat in the drawer, and set it back on the table. She went out to the slope in the last of the afternoon light and set 4 more posts before dark. She set the last post on the primary contour line on a Wednesday afternoon in late April. She stood at the top of the line and looked down its length, 93 posts, cedar, and black locust following the natural curvature of the slope, in a line that from above looked like a long, slow question mark drawn on the face of the land. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It looked unfinished because it was unfinished. The posts were structure without life, skeleton without flesh. The plants were what would make it real. She had the nursery order in process, the delivery scheduled for mid-May, gray dogwood, wild plum elderberry, selected for their root architecture, their native adaptation to Osage County soil and climate, their function as habitat. Each species had a position in the design. The dogwood would go in first, its lateral root spread doing the fastest anchoring work. The elderberry would follow, deeper rooted, slower to establish, but capable of holding a post position through conditions that would displace shallower plantings. The wild plum would go in the gaps, its thorn branches eventually creating the kind of dense cover that ground nesting birds needed, and that most Osage County farmland had not offered in 20 years. She stood at the top of the line in the late April light and allowed herself briefly the thought that had been waiting in the back of her mind since February: this might actually work. Then she went inside and wrote in the green notebook, April primary line complete. 93 posts, ready for planting phase. 2 weeks to delivery. Watch for weather. She put the notebook in her jacket pocket. She made dinner. She listened to Hector's breathing from the other room, steady present, the sound of a man still occupying his space in the world, and fell asleep thinking about dogwood roots and what they would find when they reached down into soil that had been waiting without knowing it was waiting for something to arrive and begin. The rain came without warning on the third Tuesday of May, the way serious rain always does in Osage County, not building, not threatening, just arriving as if it had been overhead the whole time and simply decided to open up. Della heard it before she saw it. She was in the barn when the first drops hit the tin roof like scattered gravel, then like a sustained drum roll, then like something that had no interest in stopping. She pulled on her rubber boots and went outside. What she saw in the gray morning light stopped her at the barn door. The western section, the 37 posts she had spent 11 days setting, tamping, leveling, had shifted. Not all of them. Maybe a third, but a third was enough. Some leaned at angles that looked almost casual, the way a person leans against a wall when they're tired. Others had pulled partially free of the ground, their bases lifted by the water moving beneath the surface, sheeting downslope the way water always does when there's nothing in the soil to hold it. She walked out into it. The rain was cold for May, the kind of cold that finds the gap between your collar and your neck, and she didn't bother pulling her hood up. She walked the line of posts, touching each one, pressing her palm flat against the wood to feel how much give remained. The cedar ones held mostly their bases deep enough, their wood dense enough to resist the pull. The pine ones had fared worse. 3 had fallen completely, lying on the slope with their bases trailing clods of dark mud. She stood at the far end of the line and looked back at what she'd built. In the rain, with the post leaning and the slope running with thin brown water, it looked like something abandoned rather than something begun. She thought about Gordon Pruitt driving past that morning. She thought about the bank letter with its 60-day clock. She thought about Hector inside, probably standing at the kitchen window with his coffee, looking out at exactly what she was looking at. She crouched in the mud beside a fallen pine post and looked at the ground around its base. The soil was saturated, moving almost like a slow liquid. She could see exactly what had happened. The post had been set to correct depth. She'd checked that 3 times, but she had planted nothing alongside them yet. The native shrubs weren't scheduled to arrive for another 2 weeks, and in the meantime, the posts had nothing holding the soil around them except the soil itself. Wet, degraded, compacted soil with almost no root structure, no organic matter to speak of, nothing to grab and hold when water came through. She had known this was a risk. She had written it in the green notebook on the 7th page, a small notation in the margin: root integration critical before significant rainfall event. She had known it and done the math and decided 2 weeks was an acceptable window. The ground had disagreed. She sat down in the mud, not because she planned to, her legs just made the decision before she did. She sat on the wet slope with rain coming down around her and the smell of turned earth so strong it was almost sweet. She stayed there for 15 minutes. She didn't cry. What she felt was something more specific than grief and less dramatic, a flat, factual heaviness, like a door closing on a calculation she'd gotten wrong. She heard boots on the wet ground behind her. Hector came and stood beside her. He was wearing his old canvas barn coat with the torn left pocket he'd never gotten around to mending. He looked at the leaning posts. He looked at the three that had fallen. He looked at the water running downslope in thin branching channels. He did not say anything. He just stood there in the rain beside her, close enough that she could smell the coffee on him, and she understood that this was the most useful thing he could have done. After a while, she pulled out the green notebook from inside her jacket and opened to a clean page. She wrote, "Failed water moved under post before root anchors established. Post with neighboring plant root structure held at higher rate. Solution accelerate planting schedule, not post setting schedule." The posts were right, the timing was wrong. Then she added one line, "Failure is not the opposite of the plan. It is part of it." Hector was already walking back toward the house. She reset the fallen post that afternoon, working alone in the rain until it stopped around 4 o'clock, the sky going from gray to a washed-out pale yellow that felt like an apology. Every post she touched told her something. The ones that had held had a particular quality of resistance when she pressed against them, a density in the surrounding ground that the failed posts hadn't had. She began to understand it was not about the posts at all. It had never been about the posts. The posts were structure. What she was actually building was soil behavior. 3 days after the rain, a white state vehicle pulled up the drive. Della was on the slope when she saw it. The truck had the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture seal on the door, and the man who got out was wearing a polo shirt with an ID badge clipped to it, carrying a clipboard. He introduced himself as a compliance inspector. Someone had filed a report, he said, with the expression of a person who finds his own job mildly embarrassing, alleging that unregulated organic material was being buried in agricultural soil on this property. Della straightened up slowly. Her hands were muddy to the wrist. She looked at the inspector, then down the road toward where Pruitt's fields began, then back at the inspector. "Come on," she said. She walked him through everything, every post, every source. She showed him the receipts from the farms that had donated the wood, showed him where she had refused treated lumber, showed him the green notebook with the materials logs she had kept since March. She walked him to the section where she had begun burying posts horizontally and explained the principle: untreated wood in the soil acts as a sponge, absorbing water during wet periods and releasing it slowly through dry ones. The wood breaks down over years and feeds soil fungi, earthworms, microorganisms that are the actual foundation of any living soil. The technique had been documented in agricultural literature going back decades and was experiencing a documented revival in regenerative agriculture operations across 7 states. The inspector crouched to look at the horizontal post she had buried near the base of the first cedar row and was quiet for a full minute. "You've got good documentation," he said finally. "I'd figured I might need to see it." "I knew someone might need to," she said. He filed his report within 10 business days. The complaint was determined inconsistent with established regenerative practice. After he left, Della stood in the driveway for a long moment. She felt tired in a way that had a particular texture, the tiredness of having had to prove something that should not have needed proving to a stranger on land that had belonged to her family for half a century. She picked up the green notebook and added one line, "Time spent on defense is time not spent on building." She did not write Pruitt's name. She called the conservation nursery that afternoon and changed her planting order. Instead of waiting for the scheduled delivery, she asked what they had available immediately. Gray dogwood 3-year stock, 37 specimens. Elderberry 2-year 22. Wild plum 1-year 41. She took everything they had and arranged pickup for Friday. Sylvie Holt arrived on Saturday morning unannounced. Della was in the back of her truck moving nursery stock when she heard a second vehicle and turned to see a dark green pickup she didn't recognize. The woman who got out was somewhere in her mid-50s with short gray hair and the kind of face that has spent 30 years outdoors and made peace with it. She moved across the yard with the efficiency of someone always slightly behind schedule who has chosen not to apologize for it. She was carrying rolled survey maps under one arm. Della Voss. It wasn't a question. That's right. Sylvie Holt State Conservation Office. Leon Gruber told me what you were doing out here. She looked at the nursery stock in the truck bed, then at the slope, then at the notebook sticking out of Della's jacket pocket. He forwarded me your planting diagram back in April. I've been meaning to get out here. Della came down from the truck. Dr. Gruber saw my diagram. He's had it since April. Sent it to me with a note. Sylvie unrolled the survey maps on the hood of her truck and anchored the corners with a water bottle and her clipboard. Show me your contour lines. What followed was 4 hours that Della would try to describe to Hector that evening and find herself unable to, not because nothing had happened, but because what had happened was almost entirely internal. Sylvie Holt did not lecture. She asked questions and then listened to the answers with complete attention, the way a doctor listens, not waiting for the person to finish, but actually taking in what was said before deciding what came next. She walked every foot of the slope. She examined the horizontal buried posts and said nothing for a full minute, just crouched there with her hand in the soil. Then she asked, what are you planting between them, and in what sequence? Della showed her the nursery stock. Explained her reasoning for each species, the wild plum for pollinator cover and bird habitat, the elderberry for its root depth and its fruit, the gray dogwood because it would spread laterally and knit the soil between post positions more thoroughly than anything else available in the local seed stock. Sylvie listened. Then you've got the sequence almost right. Plant the dogwood first, not last. Its lateral root spread is your fastest anchor. The elderberry needs 6 weeks of establishment before a hard rain can test it. If you go elderberry first and get a storm in week 3, you're back where you started. Della wrote it down. Here, Sylvie put her finger on the survey map at a point 40 feet upslope from where the post began. You want a small swale, just hand-dug 6 inches deep following this contour. It will intercept water before it reaches the post line and slow it down. You can build it in 2 days with 2 people. Della looked at the map, then at the slope. The swale position was obvious once she saw it. She couldn't understand why she hadn't seen it before, except that she had been so focused on what she was building that she had stopped seeing what was above it. In 31 years as a conservation officer, Sylvie said, rolling the maps, I have seen about 4 people figure out contour hedgerow placement from first principles without someone teaching them directly. She tucked the maps under her arm. I figured I should see what you were doing with it. She said it the way a person states a fact, without inflation, without the softness that turns a compliment into encouragement. After Sylvie left, Della planted the gray dogwood first. June came in warm and dry, which was its own kind of test. The nursery stock needed water while its roots were establishing, and the compacted soil on the slope did not hold moisture well in the first weeks. Della watered by hand each evening, watching the soil around each plant for signs of stress. The wild plum took immediately. The elderberry was slower, looking ragged and uncertain for the first 10 days before it seemed to decide to commit. The dogwood spread. She could see it in the way the soil around the first plants began to look different, slightly darker, slightly more cohesive, the surface less prone to crusting in the heat. She dug a small test hole beside a 2-week-old dogwood plant and looked at the roots, fine white threads already radiating outward, feeling for purchase in the degraded soil. She took a photo with her phone and stared at it for a long time. It was close to relief, but larger than that. It was close to being right. The email came on a Wednesday in the first week of June. She was in the barn when her phone buzzed. The subject line read, Final extension decision required by June 14th. It was from the agricultural management firm in Tulsa. They had been patient, the email said, and they remained enthusiastic about her profile, but they needed a decision within 8 days. A junior land management associate role, a real salary, health insurance, a desk in a glass building with a view of the Arkansas River. She stood in the barn for a while with the phone in her hand. The thing she kept coming back to was not the salary or the security of it, though those things were real and she was not naive enough to dismiss them. She kept coming back to a simpler question: if she left now, who would finish this? She thought about the word finish and what it meant, and whether she had ever in her life started something she hadn't seen through to the end. She put the phone face down on the workbench. She walked back out to the slope and looked at the dogwood plants, 22 days old, Now the soil around them already beginning to show that slight darkening that meant something was happening underground. She looked at the cedar posts solid and straight. She looked at the empty space between the posts where the elderberry would go, where the wild plum was already starting to put out new growth toward the light. She went back inside. She deleted the email without responding. She did not tell Hector. Not because she was ashamed of the decision, but because telling him would have made it feel like a sacrifice. It didn't feel like a sacrifice. It felt like knowing what she was doing. Hector fell in the second week of July. He was walking the near edge of the east field in the early morning, the way he had walked it every morning for 50 years, checking the fence line from habit more than necessity. Della heard it not a cry, just a sound like a heavy object settling, and found him sitting against a fence post with one hand pressed to his sternum, not in pain exactly, but in the careful way of a man who has learned to monitor something he can't see. She got him inside. She called the clinic in Pawhuska and drove him there with both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road, and the 15 miles between the farm and the clinic felt like distance in a different unit of measurement than miles. The doctor said it was not a cardiac event. He used the phrase warning episode without defining it precisely, which Della understood to mean it had been serious enough to warrant the phrase, but not serious enough to require the longer explanation. He sent Hector home with adjusted medications and instructions to rest, which Hector received with the expression of a man receiving instructions in a language he understands but considers optional. That night, sitting at the kitchen table after Hector had gone to bed, Della opened the green notebook to a fresh page. She wrote nothing for a long time. Then July 14th. Hector's episode. He is home. He is stable. The timeline remains unchanged. I will need to work faster. She stared at that word. Then she wrote underneath it, alone. The alone part was what it was. There is knowing something, and there is the specific weight of it settling in at 11 o'clock at night with your grandfather asleep in the next room and 60 days left on a bank letter in a slope full of young plants that needed tending every single day without exception. She closed the notebook, set it on the counter, and went to bed. She was back on the slope by 5:30 the next morning. It was in the third week of July, clearing out the storage corner of the barn to make space for fall equipment, that she found the box. An old wooden crate with a hinged lid pushed back under the lower shelf behind a stack of seed catalogs from 1998 and a rusted oil can, Hector's handwriting on the top in black marker, field records do not discard. She almost put it back, but the crate was in the space she needed, so she lifted the lid. Inside were notebooks. 6 of them cloth-covered, the fabric faded to different shades depending on age. She picked up the oldest-looking one. The cover was almost white, the cloth worn smooth at the corners. She opened it to the first page and read the date, March 1987. She sat down on a hay bale with the notebook in her hands. What Hector had written in 1987 was a working document, calculations diagrams, plant lists, soil notes in his cramped vertical handwriting. On page 12, there was a diagram that made Della go very still. It was a contour plan. Not identical to hers, his curves were rougher, less precise based on visual estimation rather than the survey maps she had used, but unmistakably the same principle. Hedge posts set along slope contours, native plants between them. The specific notation beside it, cedar plus locust rot resistance. Pine for soil feed below grade. He had thought through the wood selection. He had sorted by species for the same reasons she had, 36 years before she had arrived at the same conclusions. She turned pages. The project ran through the notebook for 4 months, documented with the precision of a man who took his failures as seriously as his successes. Then in late July 1987, a single line treated post-mistake. Chemical leach visible at root zones, shutting down. He had used treated lumber. That was the difference. He had not had access to the knowledge that pressure-treated wood would suppress the very biological activity his hedgerow needed to function. He had built the structure correctly and poisoned the biology. One decision 36 years ago. One missing piece. She turned to the back pages of the notebook. There was a folded document tucked into the back cover, a topographic map of the property hand-annotated with contour lines drawn in pencil. Her contour lines. Not identical, but close enough that when she unfolded her own survey map and laid it beside his, The curves matched in their general logic the way two people's handwriting can match without being the same hand. She had used this map. She was certain of it. She had found it in the kitchen drawer in February and used it as the base for her planning, assuming it was just an old property survey. She had not known it was his field map. She had not known it was the document that represented the last thing he had tried before he gave up. She sat in the barn for a long time with both maps on her knees. Then she put the 1987 notebook back in the crate, carefully replaced the lid, and carried the crate to the back of the storage room. She did not tell Hector what she had found. She needed to think about what it meant that he had left the map where she would find it without telling her it was there, what it meant that he had never mentioned any of this. There were things Hector communicated without words. She was only now beginning to understand that the range of things he had communicated in this way was much larger than she'd thought. Loretta Pruitt came on a Tuesday evening in the third week of July, 10 days after Hector's episode. Della was on the porch when the Pruitt's old Dodge came down the drive, and her first thought was that Gordon had come to tell her something about the bank. But it was Loretta alone carrying a flat cardboard box, and she came up the porch steps with the deliberate walk of a woman who has made a decision and intends to see it through before she can change her mind. Loretta Pruitt was the kind of woman who had spent her whole life standing beside someone louder than herself and had developed as a result an extraordinary capacity for precise observation. She set the box on the porch railing between them. "These were in the attic. Gordon doesn't know I'm here." The box was full of photographs. Loretta reached in and pulled out a 4x6 print, black and white, slightly curled at the edges. She handed it to Della without comment. Two young men standing on a tractor squinting into the sun. One of them had Hector's jaw, his way of standing, weight back, arms loose. The other had Gordon Pruitt's build, shorter, denser, and even at what looked like 25 years old, his particular expression, a man watching something and trying to decide what to make of it. 1974, Loretta said. First year they farmed their sections together. They ran a shared equipment arrangement for almost 15 years. Della looked at the photograph. "Gordon's not a bad man." She said it the way you say something true that has required a long time to arrive at the right phrasing. He watched Hector's ground go down, and it frightened him. When things frighten Gordon, he gets practical, in ways that don't always look like kindness. Della turned the photograph over. On the back in handwriting, she didn't recognize Hector and Gord Fall 74. First good year. "Why are you telling me this?" Della asked. Loretta was quiet for a moment. "Because when you finish what you're doing out there, Gordon is going to be the first person in this county who wants to know how you did it. And I'd rather he come to you as someone you understand than as someone you've written off." She picked up the box. "You can keep that one." After Loretta's truck disappeared down the drive, Della sat on the porch steps with the photograph in her hand and looked out at the slope in the evening light. The young plants were visible now, not just the posts, but the living material between them. The dogwood spreading its low canopy, the wild plums sending up new growth in small, quick gestures toward the light. The elderberry had finally committed its stems, thickening its root system, doing the invisible work that would in time be the reason the whole structure held. She put the photograph in the green notebook tucked between two pages near the back. The last week of August arrived with a heat that settled over Osage County like a physical weight. Della was walking the hedgerow line at 6 in the morning when she stopped. Something was different. It took her a moment to identify it. Then she heard it, quick percussive sounds from inside the hedgerow itself, from the dense low branching of the gray dogwood, where it had begun to knit together in the weeks since planting. She came closer and moved slowly, and in the space between two cedar posts, she could see movement, a small brown body low to the ground, moving through the undergrowth with the purposeful confidence of an animal that considers itself at home. She stood still for a long time. Then she took out her phone and photographed the section of hedgerow without trying to capture the birds specifically, just the habitat, the layered structure of post and plant that had without announcement become shelter. That evening, she sent the photograph to Sylvie Holt with a message. "Something moved into the hedgerow today. Ground nesting species, I think. 3 of them." Sylvie's response came within the hour. Dickcissels, most likely. Or grasshopper sparrows. Either one means your structure is reading as habitat. I'm forwarding this to Leon Gruber. Della read the message twice. Then she closed her phone, set it on the table, and went to tell Hector. He was sitting in his chair by the window. She told him about the birds directly without softening, because he had no patience for softening, and it would have felt like an insult to both of them. Hector was quiet for a moment. Then, your grandmother used to hear them out there. Said they'd been gone since the early 80s. Della thought about the 1987 notebook in the barn. She didn't say anything about that. They came back, she said. Hector looked out the window. Yeah, he said. They did. Dr. Leon Gruber arrived on a Monday morning in the first week of September, driving a university fleet vehicle with 2 graduate students and a set of soil sampling equipment that he handled with the care of someone transporting instruments rather than tools. Sylvie Holt had called the previous Thursday, her tone carrying the efficiency of a person delivering logistical information, not making social conversation. Knowing he was coming had not fully prepared Della for the experience of watching her former professor walk the length of the hedgerow line without saying anything for the first 40 minutes. Gruber moved the way he always moved in the field, differently from how he moved anywhere else. In the classroom, he had been upright, precise. Out here, he folded himself low, crouched, pressed his fingers into soil, held them near his face, turned them pressed again. He moved between post positions the way you move through a place you are trying to understand rather than simply observe. The 2 graduate students followed at a respectful distance, making notes when he stopped, staying quiet when he was thinking. Della walked behind all of them and said nothing. At the lower end of the hedgerow, where the gray dogwood had spread most aggressively in the 8 weeks since planting its lateral roots, knitting the soil around the cedar posts in a dense fibrous network, she could see when she dug small test holes beside the plants. Gruber crouched for a long time. He took a soil sample with a thin metal probe, extracted the core, held it close. The soil in that section was darker than anywhere else on the slope. Not dramatically darker, not the rich near black of bottomland that had been building organic matter for centuries, but noticeably, meaningfully darker than the pale crusted surface that the rest of Hector's land still presented. Gruber stood and turned to Della. How long has this section been actively planted? 8 weeks for the dogwood. The elderberry went in 10 days after. He looked back at the soil core. His expression was the expression of a man recalculating something. The biological activity here is ahead of what 8 weeks would typically produce. The buried posts. She said it without inflection, stating a mechanism rather than claiming credit. The pine I buried horizontally in this section was older than the other material. More advanced decomposition when it went in. It was already feeding the fungi when the dogwood roots reached it. Gruber was quiet for a moment. You sequence the decomposition stages deliberately. I sorted by species for rot resistance in the standing posts. I sorted by decomposition stage for the buried ones. He looked at her over his glasses with an expression she had seen him use in seminars when a student produced an answer that went past the question. Then he said, I need to tell you something about why I'm here. She waited. I've been working on a field assessment for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Regional soil recovery capacity in the southern Great Plains. What's possible, what's been demonstrated, what the evidence base looks like for regenerative transition on degraded agricultural land. He paused. I've been looking for operational examples, something I can point to that isn't theoretical, something with data behind it in a documented process. Della understood before he finished the sentence. She felt the understanding arrive not as excitement, but as a shift in weight, the way the significance of a situation settles differently once you see its full dimensions. You want to document this. I want to propose this property as a case study site, if you're willing. He named a figure for the NRCS site support allocation. It was not large. It was, however, precisely enough to satisfy the bank's recovery demonstration requirement, with a margin sufficient to change the nature of that conversation entirely. She looked out at the hedgerow, at the dogwood spreading its low canopy between the cedar posts, at the elderberry thick stem now, at the places where ground-nesting birds had moved in so quietly over the past 3 weeks that she had almost missed the transition, had almost not noticed that the hedgerow had become, without announcement, a place where things lived. Yes, she said. Gruber nodded once. I'll have the formal proposal to you by end of week. It was one of the graduate students who noticed walking back to the vehicle that Gordon Pruitt's truck was parked on the road. Not passing. Parked engine off, Pruitt visible through the windshield in the way that people are visible when they are not trying to be invisible, but have not quite decided to be present either. Della saw him. She walked toward the truck. Pruitt got out when she was 20 feet away. He was wearing his work clothes, the worn canvas jacket, the boots she had seen on him since she was a child, carrying a manila folder, the kind that holds documents rather than field notes bent at the corner from having been held tightly. He set it on the hood of his truck. "I need to show you something." His voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, stripped of the authority that usually underlined everything he said, the tone of a man who considers himself on balance more right than most people he encounters. What remained was just the voice without the structural support. She looked at the folder but didn't move toward it. "3 weeks ago, I called the bank." He said it directly, looking at her. "I didn't file a complaint. I didn't try to make anything happen. I just had a conversation with the loan officer about the status of the account." He put his hand flat on the folder. "I've been talking to the bank about this property for 2 years. Not behind Hector's back, he knows. I made him an offer and he turned it down, and I accepted that." He stopped. "What I didn't accept, maybe, was that someone else had a plan for it." She looked at him. "What's in the folder?" He opened it. Inside were documents, property assessments, a draft purchase proposal, correspondence with a land management firm in Tulsa. The Tulsa connection landed in her chest with a particular weight. The firm she had been offered a position with. She had not connected those two things because she had not known Pruitt had the relationship. "You called the firm in Tulsa," she said. He was quiet for a moment. That was its own kind of answer. "I put them in touch with the bank. That's all. I wasn't trying to push you out, Della. I thought you'd take the job. I thought that was the better path for you." What she felt was not the anger she might have expected. It was something more complicated. The anger was there, a clean, cold line of it, running through the center of what she was feeling, but around it was something else. She thought about the photograph Loretta had brought. 2 young men on a tractor in 1974. She thought about the 1987 notebook in the barn, Hector's handwriting, documenting a project he had tried before she was born, and Pruitt's name appearing in those pages as a collaborator who had been part of the attempt and then stopped. She thought about 30 years of proximity between two men who farmed adjacent land and understood each other in the specific way that people understand each other when they have worked through difficulty together, and about what it costs a person to watch someone they respect lose ground slowly year by year and not be able to stop it. She picked up the documents from the folder. She looked at them long enough to confirm what they were. Then she set them back down. "Come with me," she said. She walked him to the hedgerow. She did not speak while they walked. She let him see it at his own pace, the gray dogwood spreading between the cedar posts, the elderberry dents, now the wild plum already putting out new growth in small, determined gestures that spoke of a root system already working below. Pruitt walked the line without speaking. He stopped at the section where the soil had darkened most visibly and crouched without being told the way. People who have spent their lives working land automatically crouch when something in the ground warrants attention. He pressed his hand into the soil and felt what was there. He picked up a handful and let it fall through his fingers in the way that every person who has ever cared about agricultural soil tests it, checking for that crumbling quality that indicates biological health, the texture that holds together without compacting. His face did something complicated. She watched it from a few feet away. 8 weeks, she said. That's how long the planting has been in. He set the soil down. He looked at the cedar post beside him, solid in the ground. He looked at the buried pine post visible at the surface in the section she had left partially exposed for documentation, the wood already showing a pale network of fungal mycelium spreading across its surface. "Hector tried this," he said. It was not a question. "In 1987, I found his notebook." Pruitt was quiet for a moment that had a different quality than his previous silences. Heavier, more interior. "We both tried it. I gave up when my section failed." He paused. "He didn't tell me he kept going. He used treated posts. That's why it failed." Pruitt looked at her. She could see him working through the implication, the 36 years of silence, the thing Hector had kept working on in his notebooks, while telling no one the topographic map left in the kitchen drawer where a granddaughter who came home from agricultural college might find it and use it without knowing whose hands had drawn it first. He left me the map, Della said. He never told me it was his. I used it for my contour lines. Pruitt stood up slowly. He looked down the full length of the hedgerow, the long curve of it following the slope's natural contour from the top of the western rise to the lower pasture. 93 posts now threaded through with living material at every third interval, the whole structure acquiring the density that would, over the next 2 seasons, become something that would not look like a construction at all, but like something that had always been there. The bank, he said. His voice was flat in a particular way. Dr. Gruber's lab is designating this as an NRCS case study site. She said it without emphasis, presenting a fact the same way she had been presenting facts to him since March. The designation includes a support allocation. It covers the recovery demonstration requirement. He absorbed the shift in his expression that happens when the situation a person has been operating within changes its fundamental shape. He picked up the manila folder from the hood of his truck. He looked at it for a moment, then he handed it to her. She took it. "I'll call the bank," he said. "I'll tell them the situation has changed." She looked at him. There were things she could have said. She chose the one that was true without being weaponized. "I'd appreciate that." He got in his truck. He sat there for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the hedgerow through the windshield with the expression of a man looking at something he will need to revise his understanding of. Then he drove south toward his own property. That evening, Della went to the barn and found the 1987 notebook. She opened it to the diagram on page 12 and took her own contour map from her jacket pocket. She held the two documents side by side. The curves matched in their intention, if not their precision. The instinct was identical. The logic was the same logic arrived at 36 years apart by two people who had never discussed it directly. She thought about what it meant that the land had suggested the same approach to two different minds across 3 decades, that the shape of the problem contained its own solution. If you were willing to look at the problem honestly, rather than imposing a solution you already own. She put both documents back where they belonged. The day in early October that Gruber returned with the formal soil analysis results was a Wednesday, clear and cold, the sky, the specific deep blue of Oklahoma in fall. He came with Sylvie Holt, the two of them arriving within minutes of each other. The bank representative, Carol Weston from the Pawhuska branch, arrived 20 minutes later in a sedan that looked visibly out of place on the dirt drive. She carried a tablet, a leather portfolio, and the specific expression of a person who has been briefed on a meeting whose purpose she is not fully certain she understands. Gordon Pruitt arrived last. Della had not invited him. She had not uninvited him either, which amounted to the same thing. He parked on the road the way he always parked, leaving himself the option of departure, but this time he got out. He walked to where the group had gathered at the top of the hedgerow and stood at the edge with his hands in his pockets, close enough to hear everything, positioned as observer rather than participant. Gruber presented the soil analysis results standing at the top of the hedgerow with the lab report in his hand, speaking with the precise economy of a man translating scientific data into language that serves the people in front of him. The biological activity indicators in the hedgerow section were measurable and significant. Earthworm density was up. Fungal network presence was confirmed in the pine burial zones. The organic matter percentage in the top 6 inches of soil in the dogwood planting section had increased by a measurable margin in 8 weeks. Modest in absolute terms, dramatic in rate of change, given the baseline condition of the soil. He looked at Carol Weston. "What you're seeing here is a documented recovery trajectory, not a completed recovery that takes years. But the indicators are consistent and the process is replicable." He paused. "In 40 years of soil science, I have not seen a degraded site at this stage of recovery produce these biological indicators in this time frame with this level of resource investment." He said it the way he said everything as a fact without performance. The absence of drama was its own kind of emphasis. Weston looked at her tablet. She looked at the hedgerow. She looked at the lab report Gruber had handed her, running her eyes down the columns of numbers with the focused attention of a person whose job requires her to understand what numbers mean rather than simply read them. Something in her expression had changed since she arrived. The careful neutrality of a bank representative had been replaced by something more direct, more personal. The NRCS designation that's confirmed. The formal proposal was submitted last week. The preliminary designation is in effect pending the site visit, which Dr. Gruber's presence today partially constitutes. Weston made a note. The bank's position has been that the property needs to demonstrate a credible path to productive recovery. What I'm seeing here appears to constitute that demonstration. It does, Sylvie said, flatly without argument, the way you state something that doesn't require argument. I'll need to take the lab results back for review, but I don't anticipate any difficulty with the bank's position going forward. Weston looked at Della. You should hear from us within 10 days. Della nodded. It was in this moment that Gordon Pruitt spoke for the first time since arriving. He spoke from his position at the edge of the group, looking at the hedgerow rather than at any of the people around him. I told Hector this ground was finished. About 4 years ago. I told him he should think about selling before it got harder to get a fair price. He paused. I thought I was being practical. Nobody responded immediately. Della looked at him. You were being practical, she said. You just didn't have all the information. Whatever he had expected her to say, it was not that. She watched him take it in the absence of accusation, the simple factual reframe, the acknowledgement that his assessment had been reasonable, given what he knew, and wrong given what he hadn't known. It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was something more useful than forgiveness. It was the removal of the conversation from the territory of grievance into the territory of information. He looked back at this hedgerow. He looked at the birds moving in the dense lower branches of the elderberry, 3 of them, the dickcissels Sylvie had identified in August, moving through the habitat with the proprietary confidence of animals who have determined that a place belongs to them. What do you need, he said, to extend this to the eastern section? Della pulled the green notebook from her jacket pocket, opened it to the page where she had sketched a preliminary plan for the eastern slope and held it out. He took it. He looked at it for a long moment. The expression on his face was the expression of a man reading a map of territory he has been traveling without one for a long time. After the others left, Della went to find Hector. He was in the kitchen sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he was thinking about something else. She sat across from him the way she had sat across from him when she first told him she knew about the bank letter. The light in the kitchen was the specific late afternoon quality of October in Osage County amber, without warmth, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look considered. She put the 1987 notebook on the table between them. He looked at it. His hands on either side of his coffee cup did not move. His face did not change in any dramatic way. But something in the room shifted the way pressure shifts when a door opens somewhere in a house. I found it in July, she said. In the barn. He was quiet. You left the map in the kitchen drawer. Still quiet. Hector. She waited until he looked at her. Why didn't you tell me? He looked at the notebook for a moment. Then he looked out the window at the slope where the hedgerow was visible in the evening light, the long curve of it, the cedar posts, the dark spreading canopy of the dogwood. Because I failed at it, he said, and I didn't want that to be the thing you were thinking about when you started. She looked at him. You left the map, she said again, not as an accusation, but as the thing she needed him to explain. I left the map because the map was right. The project was right. It was my execution that failed. He paused. I wanted you to have the right thing without the wrong history attached to it. She sat with that for a moment. The thing he had done, leaving her the tool without the story, trusting her to arrive at the right conclusion, without the interference of his failure, settled into her understanding of him, the way things settle when they are true rather than constructed. The bank called, she said. He looked at her. We're clear. The NRCS designation covers the recovery demonstration. Weston is calling it resolved. His hands moved slightly on either side of the coffee cup. Not a large movement, just the small adjustment of a person whose body registers something the face has not yet decided to show. He looked at the slope for a long moment. Leon Gruber, he said. Not quite a question. He says the biological indicators are ahead of what the timeline should produce. Hector was quiet. Outside, the light was going the deep amber of late October evening. the hedgerow casting its shadow down the slope in the long curved line of its design, the shadow following the same contours as the structure itself, bending with the land rather than against it. "The pine posts," he said, "the ones you buried. What about them?" "I found those in 1986. A barn that came down on the Aldous Hatch property, the original barn from his grandfather's time. The wood was 60 years old even then." He paused. "I kept them because I thought they'd have a use. I didn't know what." She looked at him. The pine posts in the far corner of the barn, the ones she had found first set aside most carefully, understood immediately to be the most valuable buried material because of their advanced decomposition stage, their age, the mycelium that had already begun its work in the grain of the wood. She had thought she'd found them by accident. She had thought finding them was luck. She understood now that nothing in that barn had been placed there accidentally. There was something she needed to say. She had been carrying it since July, since the barn, since she sat on the hay bale with his 1987 notebook and felt the full weight of what he had tried to do alone for years and never told anyone. "You should have told me you'd tried it," she said. "I would have still done it. I would have done it better for knowing." He looked at her, his eyes holding more than they showed. He held her gaze for a moment in the way he held it on the rare occasions when he was giving his attention entirely to the person in front of him. "Yes," he said, "I know that now." It was all he said. It was enough. The night Della found the letter tucked into the back cover of the 1987 notebook 3 days after the October meeting, she almost missed it. The envelope was so flat against the inside of the cover that it had no visible edge when the notebook was closed. It was a plain envelope, unsealed, her name written on the front in Hector's handwriting. She stood in the barn and opened it. The letter inside was a single page dated the night he had read the bank's first letter, 2 days before she had driven back from Stillwater, 2 days before she had come home. He had written about the land, about what he had tried to do with it and what it had refused to do, and what he had come to understand about the difference between working land and working with it. He had written about the 30 years between his 1987 attempt and the night he wrote the letter, the things he had continued to think about in that time without acting on, because the one attempt had taken something from him that he had not known how to recover. Near the end, he had written, "I don't know if you can do what I couldn't, but I know you will try. And knowing that is the only thing that has made the last few years feel like something other than loss." At the bottom below his signature, a single line added in slightly different ink, as if written later or on second thought. "The map is in the kitchen drawer. The pine posts are in the back of the barn. The rest is yours." She stood with the letter for a long time. Then she folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, and tucked it into the green notebook between the page with her first post-setting notes and the page with her first planning diagram, where it would stay pressed between the record of what she had done on the way in and the record of what she had found on the way through. The winter that year was long, but not cruel. The hedgerow overwintered better than she had projected. The gray dogwood had gone dormant and come back denser in early March, its lateral spread having advanced another 14 inches on the downslope side. The elderberry stems had gone fully woody through the coldest weeks, graduating from plant to small shrub, in the way that happens underground before it happens visibly. The birds had stayed through winter, the dickcissels and grasshopper sparrows moving through the hedgerow in the early mornings with the unhurried confidence of animals operating within their home range. The doctor had cleared Hector for light walking in January, and by March he was moving better than he had since before his episode. Not the same as before, not fully, but with a steadiness that felt earned rather than restored. He walked the near field every morning again, more slowly than he used to, and with more attention, the way a man walks when he has learned not to take the walking for granted. On a warm afternoon in the second week of April, Della came out of the house to find him standing at the top of the hedgerow. He was dressed in the canvas barn coat, the boots she had known all her life. He was standing at the uphill end of the contour line, the same point where she had set the first cedar post 13 months earlier, in cold ground alone, looking down the length of what had grown from that beginning. The hedgerow at 13 months looked like what it was becoming rather than what it had been. The posts were still visible, the structure of them still apparent, but the living material had begun to close the gaps. The dogwood canopy was continuous in 3 sections. The elderberry had reached a height that made it the dominant visual element in those intervals, its stems branching at the top in the way that woody shrubs branch when they have enough root support to grow upward rather than simply outward. Between the planting positions, the soil on the slope was visibly different, darker, more cohesive, holding its structure in a way the surrounding ground still did not. Hector began to walk the line. He walked slowly but not carefully in the monitoring way he had walked since July. He walked the way a person walks a piece of ground. They have a long history with not surveying, not evaluating, just being in the place. He put his hand on the first cedar post and let it rest there for a moment, then the next. He moved through the dogwood where it had spread across the line, his shoulder brushing the branches unhurried. Della walked behind him at a distance that preserved the solitude of what he was doing. At the section where the soil was darkest, Hector stopped. He crouched slowly but without the deliberate self-monitoring of a man managing pain, the movement of a person doing something they have done 10,000 times. He pressed his hand flat against the ground. He held it there. She watched him feel what was in the soil. The thing that is not measurable with numbers, but is known instantly by anyone who has spent a life learning the difference between soil that is working and soil that has stopped. He stayed there for what was probably 2 minutes. Then a meadowlark rose from the elderberry 2 posts down. It went up in the particular way meadowlarks go up, not startled, not fleeing, but ascending with the easy confidence of a bird that does not consider the air above its territory to belong to anyone but itself. It went up, arced, came down on a fence post 30 feet north of the hedgerow, and sat there in the April light with the calm alertness of something that has determined this location to be home. Hector watched it from his crouch. His face in profile had the quality that faces have when a long question receives its answer, not triumphant, not relieved, but settled, the expression of completion rather than victory. He stood up slowly. He looked at Della. He did not say anything. He did not need to say anything. She had known him long enough to know that the look he gave her from that position on the slope in the April light, with the meadowlark sitting its fence post behind him, contained everything he knew how to express about what they had both done here, what they had done together without calling it that, what the land had done when someone understood it well enough to let it do what it had always been capable of doing. She held his gaze. She nodded once. He nodded back. He walked back to the house. She stayed on the slope in the particular quiet that follows a moment that does not require language, listening to the meadowlark and to whatever was moving in the lower branches of the elderberry. And she thought about the question she had carried since February of the year before, whether the land was waiting and understood that it had already answered. Hector passed away on a Tuesday morning in late May, 6 weeks after that afternoon on the slope. He died in his own bed in the house his father had built, with the light coming through the east window, the way it always came at that hour, and Della was in the next room. The doctor said it was his heart, which was true in the medical sense, and also true in every other sense, a heart that had held 50 years of this particular ground, that had tried and failed and kept trying in the silence of his notebooks, that had waited with the same patience he asked of the land itself for someone to come home and finish what he had started. She buried him on the property in the corner of the east field where the wild plum would eventually spread its canopy, and she marked the place with a cedar post from the original 93. Not the first one she had set, but the one she had set on the day it rained, the one that had held when a third of the others shifted, the one whose grain she had pressed her thumbnail into on that cold March morning, and known before she could have explained why that it would last. In September of that year, 5 months after the April afternoon, Della stood in the barn that had been her sorting facility, her planning room, the place where she had spent 3 weeks pulling nails from donated fence posts with blistered hands in the first cold weeks of spring. The barn smelled of dry wood and old hay, the way it had always smelled. But there was something else now, the faint earthen smell that came through the open south door from the slope, from the hedgerow, that was now, in its second full growing season, indistinguishable in its density from something that had been there for decades. She was setting up for a workshop. 14 folding chairs, a portable whiteboard, a table along the west wall with soil samples in labeled jars. The pale-crusted baseline sample she had taken in February of the first year, and the darker, looser sample from the same position taken 3 weeks ago. The difference between them visible without any scientific instrument readable by anyone who had ever cared enough about soil to pick some up and look at it. Outside, vehicles were pulling into the drive. Aldous Hatch's truck, the Pruitt truck, Gordon's with Loretta in the passenger seat. Three vehicles she didn't recognize from operations in Pawnee County, and one from Creek County, word having traveled the way it travels in agricultural communities through the slow, durable network of people paying attention to what the land is doing. Gordon Pruitt had spent the winter studying the notebook pages she had given him, had spent the spring laying the first contour line on his west section, with her walking alongside and saying almost nothing, because almost nothing needed to be said, had spent the summer watching his own soil begin slowly to change. Della went to the barn door. The September light was clear and direct in the way of early fall, the hedgerow on the slope catching it differently now than it had a year ago. The canopy higher, the structure more complex. The shadow it threw down the slope longer and more elaborate bending, with the land in the long, slow curve she had planned from a kitchen table on a February night with a folded map and a borrowed idea she had not yet understood, was also an inheritance. She picked up the green notebook from the workbench. She opened it to the first page where she had written Dr. Gruber's statement in October of her first year at Oklahoma State, with the date and his name below it. The ink was faded at the edges from 2 years of jacket pocket living, the page worn soft at the corners. She turned to the very back of the notebook, to the page she had always understood to be reserved for something she hadn't arrived at yet. In Hector's handwriting, pressed lightly in pencil so it was barely visible, unless you held the page to the light, were 4 words she had found on the morning after she buried him, when she had opened the notebook to write, and found them already there, written in a hand she would have recognized anywhere at any distance in any light. This land is waiting. She closed the notebook. She put it in her jacket pocket where it had always lived, where it would continue to live. She went out to meet the people who had come to learn what the land had taught her.